Hi everyone, this is the video lecture for week 12. So what we're going to do today is wrap everything together in the pyramid of action research. So let me go to today's PowerPoint. So the reason we're going to look at action research is because it's a great way of consolidating reflective practice, pulling together all those Brookfield's reflective lenses. But as I've said, sometimes I prefer to think of them as reflective surfaces. So that's because in action research is a very dynamic way of thinking about improving your curriculum, improving your students' learning, being professionally satisfied and drawing in your professional judgment and all those reflective surfaces or lenses that Brookfield's talked about and we've discussed richly in the semester. So the first surface, of course, is self-reflection, where we're drawing on our experiences, in your experiences as a student, some observations and work in classrooms, and emerging and evolving experience will be so important. But we want to add to that other reflective surfaces like the perspective of colleagues, more experienced colleagues, also people at a similar level of us, all can bring really valuable perspective. Then we want to obviously think a lot about students and all that they bring to us. It's a rich reflective surface where we're thinking about, yes, their experiences relating back to us. There might be official surveys like in CELT or in school-based ones, but also that anecdotal evidence, looking at body language, what students are doing now, looking at their performance, how they're going in, yes, sure, exams and tests and things like that, and just your average day-by-day work and looking at how they're writing or how they're working with a piece of equipment and getting perspective from students to see what needs to change, what needs to be improved, what needs to be consolidated. And of course, the fourth lens, or as I call it, surface, around the literature and concepts. And so all the readings that you've been doing in this course and other courses in education and much more broadly in your other bachelor degree are all very important and have a bearing on what's going on. So they're represented here in four sides of a square pyramid, like the Pyramid of Gaza. But the Pyramid of Gaza, or the Pyramids of Gaza, don't have four sides. There's the hidden side, the very foundational side that's absolutely fundamental, and I suggest that action research is a very powerful and dynamic way of holding together and relating these four reflective surfaces to give us a rich almost trajectory or agenda or systematic approach to really improving student learning, improving our own teaching. So that's why we're going to be using this as the kind of the capstone lecture for this course, Reflective Practice, because it does bring together these perspectives. And so what I'm going to do is introduce you to something that you know and relate it to action research. Now, way back early in semester, I think it was week 2, we looked at the Reflective Practice Brainstorm, and that pentagon shape we've used a couple of times. This represented a way to think about reflective practice and capturing different facets of it. So I call the centerpiece and the five shapes on the outside that all form a double pentagon like different facets of reflective thinking. And we've used that throughout the course, for example, in two of the assessment rubrics for assignment 2A and 2B. And so in a much more matrix version and linear on the left, we've got the 6 facets that I've been looking for specific evidence. So for communicate and apply, for example, I wanted that very powerful and provocative communication element of title for your report to be there. And of course, in 2A, some people didn't give me their title, they gave me my title, which I know what the assignment's about, but it doesn't tell me anything about your work. And in 2B, there's been a significant move in the whole all of you to being very thoughtful about how you communicate. So we've visited and revisited each different facet definitely and clearly and explicitly in assignment 2A and 2B, but also in other guises in the course, and we'll revisit those right now. So the reading for this week, which will be for the discussion, is on a book I just had published about a month ago called, I could like to call it MELT, The Models of Engaged Learning and Teaching, and it's a much more general version of things like the critical reflection pentagon. And in the book there's actually multiple examples where people take the general idea and represent it and configure it and articulate it in ways that are much more specific to the context, because there's no one way of representing things that are, like for example, it's brought from English to physics and to PE. There's different terminology used, different ways of representing the thinking, but there's some also things in common, and Melt likes to emphasize the commonalities without overriding the differences. So the link is here in the discussion board and in the readings for the course. And I'm just going to get you to read something specific. It's going to be chapter 5. The title is What Does It Mean? Because every chapter in the book has got its powerful and provocative question for education. And this is a centerpiece for education because what does it mean is central to why students engage in learning in the first place. So what? What happened? Why did they do this experiment? If they walked out of my own science teaching class when students had done experiments, you ask them, why did you do that? What did it mean? They would often say, I don't know. So we're really trying to prompt this powerful analysis and synthesis, putting everything together. So chapter 5 is on, you could say, the fifth facet of MELT, with this leading question, and the very much the affective domain, the more emotional or side where down the bottom the beaver is calling out creative. So each chapter in the book begins with a cartoon, much like this, where you've got Einstein and a little child calling out elements that epitomise the thinking in that chapter. And what I'm going to ask you to do is to read section 5.2, because that's about using the model for curriculum design and improvement, but specifically, as you'll see from 5.2.1, about teacher action research. So that's an emphasis in section 5.2. So that's why I'm going to get you to read that one. Now, so what I'm going to do right now is kind of walk you through the book in briefly, just to give you an overview of the other parts of the book so you see how it connects to 5.2. So you might want to read some of those other things, but you might not have time or inclination. So I can situate 5.2 in that you'll be able to see it. So the book's, as I said, has been published by Springer. You'll be able to access that and download it as a PDF. You can download the chapter, or you can download the whole book. It's free. Used a fair bit of money from University Consultancy Fund to make it open access for reasons of global equity, basically. Because I've had a lot of collaborations with people in Cambodia, Vietnam, Indonesia, Malaysia, particularly South Pacific, Fiji. So making things open access is a big thing from my perspective. So feel free to share the link with anyone. They don't have to pay anything at all. They just go to the link and pretty much download the book. So this is my preferred cover. This is the one I want to use. We've been using this logo for a couple of years because it captures the idea of MELT. And MELT, Models of Engaged Learning and Teaching, was a fortunate and accidental acronym because the idea of fluidity is very important here. Like taking solid structures, like those rubrics I showed you that we've used, but defrosting them with the warmth of human conversation so they flow so that in that fluidity they take on a new shape in your contexts and other contexts, and then become rigid again, ready for use. But it's that warmth of human conversation and sense making that's so important in melt, and that things do flow and adapt and change context by context, because I learned the hard way that it's very hard to represent things that will please everyone. People have to use their professional judgments to change. So the actual book from Springer has got this cover, which is pretty bland and ubiquitous for me. But hey, so that's what you'll see first. And I'm just going to guide you very briefly. This is the kind of ebook version. There's a PDF version as well. So just to use the cartoons to highlight that. So the first facet of melt, the centerpiece, is commonly embark and clarify. And the question for that is, what is our purpose? What are we trying to engage in? And that's absolutely central to student learning. And often it's very hard for students to know what their purpose is. Hard for you as a university student to know what the lecturer is after and what do they want in this assignment. And so this is a very difficult thing to get a handle on. And you can refer to what Einstein little childs say in the book. But for the beaver, who always calling out things that epitomise the affective domain, he's saying it's driven by being curious, a curious student. And in fact, Einstein says, I'm not particularly gifted or talented, but I am very, very curious. It kind of drove him in his research. And so this chapter obviously both outlines the purpose of the book, but it also outlines the purpose of MELT and the absolute need in education for connecting the things that often look different, where problem solving looks quite different from researching, looks different from evidence-based decision making, looks different from critical thinking. And there are some good differences besides the terminology, but there's also a lot of overlap. And as I said earlier, this book emphasises the overlap, but it also recognises that the absolute need for change, adaptation, discipline-specific terminology, subject-appropriate terminology, and age-appropriate, of course. So, Chapter 2 focuses on what will we use if we've got this purpose, what do we need, what information, what sources, what do we have to generate data, what methodologies, is there equipment we need to access, all sorts of things, and to actually find quality information or generate useful data. The beaver says a prime characteristic, you need to be determined. And so this particular chapter more formally introduces the models of engaged learning teaching itself, or themselves, because there's models, many models, like one overarching framework, but a million models to fit a million contexts. So this chapter introduces all the 6 facets, but as chapter 1 and the preface have stories in them of children in schools, or there's very young children in primary school, 13-year-old children in high school, and then this chapter actually looks at university graduates. So in those 3 different contexts, introducing the 6 different facets of MELT as they look to from the perspective of those students. So it's trying to use story and analysis to bring the models to life. So if we move to chapter 3, so this question of how do we arrange, if we've got information, data, all sorts of stuff from others and from ourselves, and we're trying to organise it, how do we put it all together? So that organising management, including teamwork and time. The beaver says a central thing we're trying to do is harmonise everything. So harmonise people, harmonise the relationship amongst the data, whether it's quantitative or qualitative, and trying to organise it in a way that you can be able to see patterns and trends. And I should say that chapter 2, chapter 3, sorry, how to arrange, has a lot of the examples from early childhood to PhD supervision, and so undergraduate, high school, and senior primary as well. So chapter 3, you might browse through to see a number of different examples. In fact, the early childhood song Research Mountain is inspired by the 6 facets and written by an early childhood teacher, Marcia Seaborn and Elizabeth North, and it's just been annotated to point out where the facets come in, but she directly used the melt to write that song. A problem-solving pentagon we were using in primary school. Inquiry framework for international baccalaureate. Right Science, some resources that I was using myself when I was teaching, but I've updated them with using kind of a right pentagon in effect. Some various examples of use. This is a mathematics one, curiously called Keep Calm and Carry a Pentagon, but it focuses on maths and overcoming anxiety. And then matrix versions, much like the ones you've seen with your own rubric. The original problem-solving pentagon made by engineering students at University of Adelaide, work integrated learning framework, and one for PhD supervision and PhD students. So that's just some of the examples that you might want to flick through. Chapter 4, the question there is, what do we trust? So we've got this information and we're arranging it, but really, is it believable at all? And normally this comes third, and the question of how do we arrange comes fourth. The sequence isn't critical, but of course having a sequence is good, because sometimes you can start off teaching things in linear ways, but with sophisticated thinking, the linearity usually goes out the window, because you need to move back and forth and evaluate and reflect this facet, or the central question of what do we trust, really is woven throughout the whole process. So it's not about a step and sequence. It's more about making sure that we're addressing each facet at appropriate times. That's why we use the term facet. It's more like a diamond or a jewel that has different faces that sparkle and shine, and depends which one you're turning, gives you the angle that you're looking at that time. So this question is central to education. What do we trust? Because we're at risk of our students becoming gullible consumers in the information age. What we want was to be discerning users. So this facet is unpacked again with further stories and details, and looking at what we, not just students, but for teachers, for you and I. Also, what do we trust? Do we, there's all sorts of debates about like reading, like with phonics and whole language, for example, or in history, there's a kind of the history wars, and then there's arguments about nationwide testing and the benefits of that, and also the downsides and the negative things about teachers teaching to the test. So the trust issue is big. I've already said chapter 5, what does it mean? So that's what you'll be looking at a bit of detail. But that analysis and synthesis, where interestingly we're very much connecting that through the beaver to being creative. The synthesizing process, putting all the different bits together in ways that are new to the students learning, but and often that's how we learn to be much more innovative and do different things. And so analyze and synthesize has a very creative element to it, even though those words can often be very formal, cognitive, and almost sound like a logical and linear process. But at the same time, as Einstein actually says here, knowledge is limited, but creativity circles the earth. And he relied so much on thought experiments and creativity, riding his bike on the front of a beam of light to imagine what light is doing, and things like that, to make sense of the world. So that creative process is very central and very important in the action research, which is 5.2. So chapter 6, how do we relate? It's all about to communicate and apply, because to communicate, like I've been asking you for titles, is to communicate up front. What is this about? Why would I even bother reading this? To apply is to take things that my current understanding and applying it to this situation now, just like you're applying your knowledge of teaching and learning and trying to apply it to what I'm saying at the moment and into the future. The communicate and apply for the Beaver is all about being a constructive person, being a constructive teacher, as opposed to being self-serving or trying to be just merely persuasive. And whilst we want to have persuasive writing and persuasive titles, but our prime concern here is to be a builder, build up, constructive. And so in this chapter, how we relate to each other, small audiences, small groups, pairs, teachers, the whole class, school, parents and teachers, how relators and how our students relate is important, and how we apply our knowledge base to what's happening and what's coming up into the future. And then chapter 7, the final chapter, how much guidance. So how much structure and guidance do students need in your class? If there's 30 students, do they all need to be moving at the same pace? Because that's the easiest thing to do with teaching. But you could say with online technologies, we've got increased scope to be able to differentiate the classroom and think, well, do some students need a lot of structure and guidance, and other students actually are ready and proven themselves able to really, for me to take my hands off the wheel, and they can actually take some more risks and pose their own questions, for example. So the central issue around learning autonomy is very big in MELT. So there's the 6 facets that I've showed you, but then student autonomy, learning autonomy, is absolutely a central question in education, much like the trust one. But it's one that we don't talk about much. We don't say, oh, how much autonomy will I enable these students? But Vygotsky, for those of you who know, that Russian psychologist, is pretty well known in education. Some of his work on the zone of proximal development, which sounds like a fancy thing, but the simple translation of that for teachers has often been model, scaffold, fade. And the modelling is, this is what's appropriate here, this is how you do it. The scaffold is actually just providing some limited structure for students to work within without that level of modelling and guidance. And then the fade is to give them full control. So that concept is around learning autonomy. But in MELT, for the student, it's what the student does more than what I said for model, scaffold, fade is what the teacher does. So we tend to use student-orientated verbs, much like the 6 facets. So powerful driving verbs are what the students do: find and generate, evaluate and reflect, embark and clarify. That's what the students do in their learning. So we often, in MELT, the question can be boiled down to what the students do. So follow, and sometimes I use the word emulate. So, but to follow, okay, you model the procedure, but the students actually engage in it and follow it. It's kind of active. The next one is improvise. So if you provide scaffolding as a teacher, you're hoping the students will kind of rattle around within that scaffolding. So they'll kind of be improvising, much like a jazz musician works within the existing musical structure to improvise. And whenever we've got a problem, there's certain parameters already there, but we're kind of trying to get around certain obstacles by improvising. So basically improvising is about improving something that's already there. And then the final one, to initiate, where the students drive it. And that's where we might fade and the students initiate. But the whole thing gets much more complex than that. But to really be aware, MELT brings very much to the forefront that question about how much guidance, and really always makes us think about each student and the whole class, and how much differentiation we can create. So it also asks questions about how much guidance we need as educators as well. So that's the 7 chapters of the book, 7 guiding questions, 6 facets, and the consideration of autonomy. And when you're reading chapter 5, we're using especially the 6 facets to think about teacher action research or curriculum action research, and bringing together the 4 book-filled lenses, or the 4 reflective surfaces, to engage in a very intentional process. And Melt gives us one model for thinking about us as teachers. What are we engaging in for the action research? What's my question when we embark? Or have I got an issue that I've identified? Or is it do I make it as a problem statement? And often we might start that first, but it might be something that emerges. So what we do to embark is often to re-embark and clarify and re-clarify. And action research, as we'll discuss in the tute, goes through cycles where you're adding clarity, you're adding rigor, sophistication over time. But you might start very small and simple. You're always coming back to the centre to clarify and re-clarify. Then you're finding information, students' own perspectives, giving feedback on their experiences, looking at their exam results, looking at their test results, looking at their daily engagement or disengagement. All those things are very important. Let's call that data, where you're building that picture over time. You're evaluating it and thinking, well, I'm making decisions on this class and improving the next lesson, improving the class the next time it runs, based on this data that I'm collecting. Can I trust it? Does it relate well to the next cohort? Can I connect it? But primarily, is it trustworthy? And a part of that facet to evaluate and reflect is very much to think about the reflection side of things, where to evaluate with reflection means that we're saying, is this process good enough? Could I have done a better job in the data I've collected? And so we'll look at each facet. In 5.2, you'll be linking that to action research, and then we'll do as we always do in the tutes, think about the application of that in classes, and in a way to bring together all of your reflective practice to make it strong, consolidated, purposeful, directed, and moving on forward, even though it'll probably be zigzagging and taking different shifts and turns, but being be something that's ultimately communicable to other colleagues. As you improve your curriculum and getting some successes and getting rid of the things that weren't working so well, you can communicate to your colleague in your office, and maybe to the broader school staff. You might eventually go to conferences, which hopefully will be open again, and then on to maybe national conferences. So you can start really small with action research and see how it goes, and add sophistication, rigor, and breadth of communication as you go. So I'll look forward to seeing you in the tute, and we'll begin to apply this and the reading and the discussion board comments in the final tutorial for week 12. So all the best as you finalise assignment 3 together.